Hello, welcome to the Music Thing Shed. Today I'm going to build one of these. So this is the new control module. This is one of the kind of earlier prototypes with a funny sort of metal PCB panel. But in here is the first of the sort of proper production runs. So this is not a proper Thonk kit. If you bought from Thonk in the past, you'll know they are much more neatly put together than this. We've got the PCB, then there is a bag with all the parts in there. So there's a power cable and some LEDs in there. These are 3-pin LEDs, so you have to be really careful how you orientate them. A bag of switches, knobs. We're only going to need 4 big chunky pots. These are the pots that are used in kind of big 5U modulars and those nice Synth tech modules. That's basically it. It's that and a bunch of Thonk sockets. And then somewhere in here will be the power header, which is the first thing we do. Now, whenever I run build workshops, and sometimes when I'm building things myself, one of the things that can go wrong is that you put the power header on the wrong side. So power header like this has long pins and short pins, and it should go out the back like this. You can see there, as you know from any other modules you've used. So on the board here we can see the most of the components on the board are already put in. These are surface mount components that have been put on in the factory. So these are all the kind of op amps, resistors, transistors there, and capacitors. They've already been populated, and the way the board works is this is the front, this is the back. So there's a big Music Thing Modular logo on the back, and the power header goes there. So this is the thing we're going to solder in first. Now what I might do is find a couple of sockets. So you can kind of balance it there. So I don't know how well you can see from there, but that's now pretty much parallel to the work surface, which means this is held in place quite neatly. So I'll just tear off a bit of solder here. Any soldering iron that has power, has temperature regulation is going to be fine. I'm also, you'll hear a little noise in the background because I've got an extractor here. Not super effective, but it does kind of work. So I might move this round a bit just so it's kind of pointing towards the extractor a bit more. Make sure the tip of my iron is clean and sharp. Then we should just be able to put those in. So that there is soldered in, and that's coming out the back, and I have successfully put it the right way round and not the wrong way round. So that's a good start. Two things that are kind of most important when you're building are really having enough light and whatever you need to be able to see. So some people use kind of magnifying things. I always just take my glasses on and off because that's the way my eyesight works. Next thing I'm going to do is put in the LEDs. So these have 3 pins and there is a flat edge. Let's see, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but around the bottom of the edge there's a kind of lip that goes around there, and one side of it is flat, so I can see it there. That side's flat, the other side is kind of circle. So you've got to keep an eye on the flat sides and make sure you've identified the flat sides. And then on the PCB you can see there's these big flat lines along the PCB sides there. So you just make sure that the flat line on the LED matches up with the flat line on the PCB. So that one will go in like that. Now what we're going to do now is place a lot of the parts onto the board, kind of hold them there, and then sort of make the sandwich with this to make sure everything is held in roughly the right place. But I'll go through this in detail. So the first thing I'm going to do is do the top 2 rows of the module here. So we're going to put in 8, is it 8? Yeah, 8 of these sockets. So they go along here. Take off, if there's a washer on the socket, just take it off, a nut rather on the socket, take it off before you do anything else. So really this, because so much of this is surface mount, it's already soldered, really this kit, or this build is more mechanical than everything else. It's making sure everything is lined up nicely. So that's those. We now need, sorry, I'm just looking at the instructions I wrote before. Assemble the top 2 rows of the module, the sockets, switches, and the change difference LEDs. So these are the change and the difference LEDs. So I'm checking for the flat side is there. So we just need now 3 switches, 4 switches even. There's 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you just place everything in there, but don't solder anything yet. So we place them all in. Then we want to attach the front panel. So you hold it up. You've got to sort of push those down a bit so they can fit through. Make sure these bits are kind of flat. Then pop that in. There you go. So those are all kind of in place now. What you do is solder just 1 point. I'm actually going to do just 1 point on these outside edge ones here. That's 1. So let's just look back over that, take it off. Make sure those 2 on the end are kind of square and flat. That one there could maybe be a bit flatter. Okay, so that's it. Right, what we can do now, we've got those 2 on the edges in, just held on by 1 solder point. So out of all that, there's only 2 solder points holding it in. Put it back on, and then we'll put washers onto these 2 outside edge ones here. These little 3D printed so screwdrivers come from exploding shit. So you've now got the 2 panels, and you can see these are pretty parallel. The other components are all just held in because the 2 on the edge have got 1 solder point in them. So that is looking pretty good. Everything's lined up pretty well. One thing to do is to just position the LEDs how you want them. So you want them to be kind of consistent, I suppose. So they're kind of poking out. You can have them however you want them, but just you probably want them consistent across. So that's all pretty much how you want it. Now we can run along and solder the whole thing. I have this very neat kind of PCB holder, but you could just balance this on your desk as well. I'm going to solder the sockets and the LEDs. I'm not going to solder the switches yet. and you'll see why in a moment. So I think that's nearly there. These rows of 3 pins are the sockets. There's the 2 LEDs. I can now trim off the legs of the LEDs. So now the screws here are kind of, they've got a little bit of play wobbling up and down. Not the screws, the switches. What I kind of like to do with these is have them as flush back as I can. Get my spool of solder, and you can do this however way you want. That's there, so that's kind of held up. I then reach behind, push up the socket, push up the switch, just solder the middle pin. I'm just soldering 1 pin at a time because then they're still quite easy to manipulate if they're in the wrong place. Just check they're all in place so they're kind of flush back against the PCB. So now I will remember, go back and solder the other 3 pins, the other 6 pins even. Oh, okay. Okay, so we've now done the whole of the top row. I'm going to take off these two nuts on the end. So we've put on this top row. The next thing we're going to do is get on to the pots. So we need 4 of these. And there's a little bit of working with these before we put them on. These will come with 2 washers each. Okay, so what you do is you put one onto the pot, onto each pot before you install it. So this is all about the depth behind the panel. So you want to make sure it's the right depth for the knobs you're going to put on there. Okay, then you take the PCB. These obviously go. Actually, one more thing that I do is you'll see these have got 2 sort of legs on each side. I usually just fold them down so they end up looking more like that, just a bit neater. And this is probably the moment to do that. You could probably just do them against, with a spanner or against the desk. Whatever it is, you're just folding these 2 tabs in. Okay, so once they're done, so these are now prepared, each pot, so you then insert them into here. It's a little bit fiddly, you've got to get the legs through, and just, which may have bent a bit in transit or while you were fiddling with the back of them. They go through the hole, the square hole. It's a bit bent. And there, so they are just kind of floating there loosely. We can probably also put in the other LEDs as well at the same time, so let's get those. So again, being really careful with the LEDs to make sure you've got the flat side There is the flat side on that one. That's going up. So these are all in place. And now put the panel back on. So this is all just, we haven't soldered anything at all yet. Everything's kind of flopping about, which is fine. And we know our top row is right. So it's just getting these in, getting them through. Always a bit fiddly. But that's pretty good. So we can now put a couple of washers back on the sockets at the top. Just to hold that whole sandwich together. And you're just making sure that those two boards, once again, are parallel. Let's tighten those up because I have this fun attachment. So yeah, those boards look pretty much parallel. So what you need to do now is put the other nut onto these pots. So you can see the pots are held completely securely onto that front panel. You know, they're not going anywhere. They've got two big nuts holding them in place. Do this just by hand. I wouldn't use a spanner on these yet, but do, you know, make sure they're properly solid, they're properly tightened up there. So just make sure they're really snug and properly bolted onto the front panel. And then again, just check everything is parallel. So now you can see these are, there's some amount of play still in there. So it's making sure, you know, just by eye I think, but making sure that the front board and the back board are parallel. If they were not parallel and you solder stuff together, there's a risk there'll be a bit of, you know, kind of tension somewhere there. But that looks pretty good to me. Now make sure the LEDs are positioned at the sort of depth you want them, just to match up with the other ones. Again, you do that by eye. You could possibly put something on there to push them down, I'm not sure. I think that's pretty good. So now we can solder all of those points into place. So this is all pretty straightforward, it's just running down the back of these. While you're soldering, you will notice on the back there's a little sort of thank you box. So I'm just reading it down while I solder these. So it's inspired by Herbert Billar and Harry Olson. So those, I believe from memory, I think they're the people who created the RCA Mark II synthesizer, which is this enormous sort of 1940s, 50s maybe synthesizer that was really one of the first, I think one of the first voltage control synthesizers, and went to visit it a couple of years ago, and it is just an extraordinary, enormous kind of room-sized piece of equipment that no longer works. It was working until relatively recently, but they haven't actually fired it up for the last sort of decade or two. And it has very good, very big knobs on it, so that was why they got on the list. Who else is on there? Tom Armitage is the person, a friend of mine in London, who helped design the 16N, which is that fantastic sort of fader bank that you might have seen lots of the sort of monomate people use it. Stretta is another person who I think is now a professor of music in America, who I remember made a lot of videos using that Monome Arc, which is another sort of amazing sort of big gestural controller. Paul Schreiber, who is the makes those Synth modules, which was why I wanted to end up using these pots. Who else is on there? Marcus Fisher, who again is Marcus Fisher and Monome, both people who I found kind of quite inspiring in the way they use controllers, the way they very kind of, I suppose, sort of purposeful, sort of the opposite of the kind of hot knobs DJs you see. Who are kind of tweaking something because it looks like they should tweak something. Who else is on there? Menki from China, who again has produced a whole load of just amazing modules that are all about gesture and movement. As has Rob Hordijk, who's the guy who developed the Benjalin, which is. Oh, I've missed a pin there, I think. This fantastic sort of Dutch designer. And Nonlinear Circuits from Australia, who some of the circuits in here are essentially lifted from him. So the difference output there, which gives you a sort of essentially a random output depending on how the knobs are set, is one of his circuits. Military standard 1472F is a military standard in America which tells the military how they should space and define interfaces for anything. But that has a section on how knobs should be spaced, how big they should be, how they work if you're wearing gloves, how they work if you're not wearing gloves, those sorts of things, which I found kind of funny when you read that and you compare it with Eurorack with lots of little tiny knobs. Knobfeel.co.uk is a funny website mainly about sort of vintage hi-fi, but just celebrating again big knobs there. Heinbach, Dennis Verschoor, who have both done a lot with the sort of vintage test equipment stuff, which again is another sort of just very different types of interfaces from the little tiny interfaces you get nowadays in lots of Eurorack. And finally, Harry Davies, who was the founder of the Davies Knob Company, who make these knobs and also these kind of very fancy and expensive knobs over here. So we are now basically done. So I'm going to just put these on and then I'll go and test it. So put them on, just make sure they are able to move freely. Sometimes you just have to lift them a tiny bit up from the surface so they're not pushing down. Yeah, that's pretty smooth. I'll get these all on and obviously align them properly. I'm not going to do this too carefully because I'm not going to put all the nuts on because I'm going to go and test this, make sure it's working. And if there's anything wrong, I don't want to have to take everything off again. But there we are. That is how the construction works.